53 years later, I'm still here. I'm still in the park, and I'm talking to government officials, some of them at the highest level, and I'm giving them my opinion as to what they should do in order to save orangutans from extinction. And they're beginning to listen.
This is Life's Tough, Explorers Are Tougher, and I'm your host, Richard Wiese. Scratch the surface of an explorer and you'll find an adventure and a great story. This show is about their tales. This podcast is a proud supporter of the Explorers Club and the EC50 initiative, 50 people changing the world that the world needs to know about. For more information, go to explorers.org. Few people have lived a life as intertwined with a single animal species as Dr. Birute Galdikas. For over 50 years, she has studied and protected the elusive and intelligent orangutans of Borneo. She was part of an extraordinary experiment led by the legendary paleoanthropologist Louis Leakey, who sought to uncover the secrets of our primate relatives by sending 3 women, Jane Goodall to study chimpanzees, Dian Fossey to study gorillas, and Dr. Galdikas to study orangutans. These women were known as the Trimates. Birute, welcome. I'm so happy to see you, and I think the first thing I have to do is congratulate you on your Explorers Club medal. That's the highest honor they give to explorers, for the last 120 years. So congratulations.
Well, thank you so much, and I feel very privileged and very honored and delighted to have won this extraordinary medal. I feel humbled as well.
I have to ask you, just going back to that idea of trimates, and I'm sure people have asked you this, 1,000 times, what was the rationale of Louis Leakey setting up this idea of trimates, and how did you get involved?
Well, I don't think Louis Leakey intentionally set up the idea of primates. I think it just grew out of his experience. So, for instance, Jane Goodall wanted to study primates, and he supported her, and she was his secretary. Obviously an extraordinary woman. And then Dian Fossey came up to him, and she wanted to study gorillas, mountain gorillas. And then a few years later, I came up to him after a lecture at UCLA, where I was a graduate student, and asked for his help to get me to Southeast Asia so I could study orangutans. So it kind of gradually grew. One thing I do know about Louis Leakey was that he was a very intrepid person who was a very good judge of people. And so when you think of the qualities that led Jane Goodall to do what she did and what led Dian Fossey to do what she did, these were incredible, or are incredible women. And then, finally you have me. So,
you said that Jane Goodall was his secretary. It seems that if this were 2025, chances are you'd have a hard time convincing other people that you were sending a secretary to go study any species, right?
No, because Jane Goodall came specifically to Africa to study wildlife. And she called up Louis Leakey, who was the head of the museum in Nairobi, and persuaded him of her qualities. And so he hired her. So it wasn't that this was a woman who came and said, I want to be your secretary. This is a woman who came to him and said, I want to study wildlife.
Got you. Dian Fossey and Jane Goodall were already in place by the time you started. Had you heard about their work at that point?
The first time I heard about Jane Goodall, I remember the exact moment. And that moment was I was sitting in a psychology class at UCLA, and the psychology professor in front of the class started talking about a young British woman who was living with chimpanzees. I didn't know her name. I knew nothing about her. But when he talked about her, I realized that he was talking about me. And the reason I realized that he was talking about me is because I had long wanted to go and study orangutans. So Jane Goodall was an inspiration. She demonstrated that it could be done.
I look at most people's origin story. A lot of scientists or even, people of the public look at you as this highly, highly accomplished woman who's just maybe changed the face of orangutans. But everybody has an origin story. And so how did you first get started even being interested in animals, much less studying them in Borneo?
Well, I just want to say one thing. When I went into the field to study orangutans, I already was a doctoral student. I already had qualified for my PhD thesis. And so I had reached the point in academia where, I was ready to go. But my origin story is that ever since I was a little girl, I would lie at night in the evening, look up at the stars and wonder, where did we humans come from? And that's where it began. And I always had a fascination with animals. My father in particular was an animal lover. He didn't talk about it, but he lived it. And my mother was a nature lover. I mean, when I was a small child, she would take me out to Hyde Park in Toronto, where we lived, and show me, leaves on the ground, trees, whose leaves we could actually use to make tea. So that's where it began. And then, how did I become fascinated by orangutans? Well, it took one picture. And I remember that picture to this day. And probably somewhere I still have that picture. And it was a picture of a Sumatran sub-adult male. And when you looked at him, it was like you were looking at a human being, as long as you didn't look below the lower lip, where his jaw was prognathous, but he looked just like a human being. And he looked at you with such a gaze. This is a picture. This is a black and white picture. And from that moment on, after I saw that orangutan, that picture, I became fascinated with orangutans.
Our mission is to empower the next generation of explorers. If you like this podcast, please recommend it to a friend and have them join the expedition. They always say that there's these life-changing events for people, moments like seeing a solar eclipse, very different, very, extraordinary event. People had always told me that about mountain gorillas, and friends I have who've actually orbited the Earth have said they get this thing called the overview effect, in which it's just a very strong emotional connection. So, I always felt with going in to see a solar eclipse or seeing mountain gorillas that it's a very finite time that you get to see it. The solar eclipse, maybe like 2 or 3 minutes. Mountain gorillas, generally for most people, it's about an hour. And I felt a lot of pressure in each case to have that life-altering experience. But when I was in Borneo at your camp, and I stayed there for several days, I felt like I was able to relax, kind of take them on their own terms, and as you say, look into their eyes and just feel something so different. So I'd have to say the life-altering experience came really more. I just felt the orangutans were so much more complex and interesting than even the mountain gorillas. Have you had other people describe that?
Well, all I know is sometimes, people look into an orangutan's eyes and their lives change. And I'll give you an example. I had a banker from Chicago come as a volunteer, and a sub-adult male orangutan took her hands in his, drew her hands to him, and gazed into her eyes. And that changed her life. She went back to Chicago. She dumped her financier boyfriend, and she became a veterinarian. And I got a postcard from her, once she graduated and was a full-blown veterinarian. So I have to tell you, one of the things about that incident is now it couldn't happen. Because Camp Leakey, for many, many years, before sort of the world blew up and people started traveling and going to places, it was a very different place. And it was a place where you could walk along a path and an adult male orangutan would walk towards you, and he wouldn't stop and you wouldn't stop, and you would nod at each other, and both of you would keep on going in your separate directions. And it was one of those places where, when I think back on it, please remember I've been there now 53 years. A place like that couldn't exist anymore. You know, it's a different kind of universe that orangutans have inhabited during their evolutionary history to where they are now. Now things are changing. And I also see that orangutans are changing somewhat. They're not the same creatures that I knew, the same individuals that I knew 53 years ago, 50 years ago, 40 years ago, because life has gotten tough. And you know, it's similar to what's happened in modern life to humans since COVID. The chimpanzee researchers worked with groups of chimpanzees. Well, they were conservationists mainly, but also researchers. And chimpanzees live in territorial groups. And they actually do go out and raid other groups and kill them and sometimes cannibalize their babies, you know. And chimpanzees are also very dominance oriented. I had a friend who studied chimpanzees in captivity, and she said every time she left, you know, to go home for the weekend, she would come back on Monday, and what did the chimpanzees say to her? They said, "Who's dominant today?" You know, you don't see an orangutan for half a year or a day or 2 days. And what is the question the orangutan has? The question the orangutan has, what's to eat today? It's a different universe. They're not paranoid. And, you know, I've seen orangutans, you know, take food from other orangutans. And in fact, my children, my adult children, do a very good imitation of me doing what they call the Siswi move. And that is, you know, Siswi would have a bunch of fruit next to her. And then another orangutan, she'd see another orangutan close by having similar fruit, and she'd go and take the fruit away from, you know, her colleague. And so my kids made fun of me because sometimes I would do that.
You're sort of speaking about the differences between chimps and orangutans. Do you feel that one mirrors humans more? That sounds like the chimps are more human-like in terms of their bad traits.
The chimpanzees are our siblings, they're our cousins. So are gorillas and so are bonobos. But just because chimpanzees and bonobos are very different doesn't mean that neither one of them is not our cousin. They are our cousins. They're very close. And what they indicate is that different environments, different ecologies can create different kinds of societies. But you see, orangutans are something different. And, you know, it may sound crazy, but, you know, all animals are unique. All individuals are unique. But there is something about orangutans that makes them the uniquest of the unique. So when we look into the eyes of an orangutan, it's not like looking into the eyes of a chimpanzee. Now, don't get me wrong. I love chimpanzees, and you know, and I'm absolutely awed by gorillas, and I've had some interesting interactions with bonobos in zoos. But when you look into the eyes of an orangutan, you're seeing somebody that mirrors your own eyes and your own soul, because you're looking into somebody that basically is more closely related to our human ancestors, to our hominin ancestors, than we are.
Are you said things have changed forever, or at least in the near future for them, and it doesn't paint a pretty picture, nor does it paint a pretty picture of humans. So at this point, after 53 years, what's the direction that you are now going towards, at least saving, protecting? I don't even know the term you want to use at this point. Or do you think it's a more comprehensive thing on humans?
Well, you know, of course I worry about humans. Obviously, I'm a human, you know, live a human life, you know, have human attributes, human family, human community. But I have to do everything in my power to to save orangutans from extinction, in the last few months, I have been so optimistic and also a little depressed, but optimistic about the new Indonesian government. And they're actually listening. Some of the people in the government are listening to what I have to say.
Would you have done anything differently now if you had to sort of talk to yourself 53 years ago and set yourself on a direction? Would you have gone on a different direction with your conservation efforts or awareness? What would you have done differently?
I probably wouldn't have done that much more different. I probably would have been somewhat bolder. But please remember, I am trained as an anthropologist, as an archaeologist. I got my degree in biological anthropology, my PhD. While I was a graduate student, I did a lot of archaeology. And that archaeology took me to different places. That immersed me into a totally different environment, cultural environment. And so when I went to Indonesia, I went there and I realized I was a foreigner in a foreign land, and I had to do what the Romans did. And so, I tried to do my best to be, as Indonesian or as native as I could. I'm not saying I was successful, but, I did marry a traditional indigenous Dayak who hunted with a blowgun. Married for him for 43 years until he died about almost 3 years ago, and I can't think about it because I'll start crying. And and I always played the long game. I tried. I guess after 53 years, you can say, well, perhaps you did okay at the long game. But what I tried to do is I tried to understand what the mores of the local people were and try not to upset them, but without giving up my own identity. I was still who I was. I learned Indonesian, I bowed to Indonesians, I did my best. And so the only thing that I regret, going back to your original question, is that I probably should have been more forceful. So I'll give you an example. Please don't think me arrogant or anything like this, but, I was adopted by the Minister of Forestry, the Indonesian Minister of Forestry. And, we had a very placid, calm relationship. We never met in private or anything like that. There was always people present. But he adopted me. But people around him, he's a very powerful man. And people would come to me and they would say, what do you want? And I would always say, I don't want anything. And now, in retrospect, I should have asked for a forestry concession. The minister was giving them left and right. It never occurred to me because I was working what was then a national park, and I was very happy that I was able to be there, that I was given the privilege of actually being able to work in an Indonesian forest.
You spoke about Jane Goodall earlier. She's a worldwide celebrity, right? People go there. She seems to be able to move things based on her celebrity. Do you feel that sort of embedding yourself so deeply in the work and in the Indonesian lifestyle that it may have maybe affected your messaging overall to a global community?
I was, at once I was instrumental, but a small national park was established in Sarawak, and that was because we had our organization had a grade 8 conference there. And the premier of Sarawak, to the surprise of his own cabinet, established a national park in honor of the grade 8 conference. So you can't backtrack history. 53 years later, I'm still here. I'm still in the park, and I'm talking to government officials, some of them at the highest level, and I'm giving them my opinion as to what they should do in order to save orangutans from extinction. And they're beginning to listen.
If you look at the Trimates, if we're just using them as sort of an example, Dian Fossey lost her life as a result of her advocacy. Jane Goodall says that as a result of her advocacy, she lost her marriage and maybe any kind of motherhood she would have. Is there anything in life that you say, wow, I wonder what it would have been to have this? What is the big sacrifice you feel like you had to make personally?
Well, I think you can talk to my adult children, and they are the ones that made the sacrifice. You know, I really can't see going a different trajectory than the one I've gone.
You know, I think, again, there's got to be a part of you that still thinks about that little girl and that all of your life has been so fantastical that it must, at some point, be a little surreal.
You learn lessons in life as you get older and you have many different experiences. First time I went into the jungles of Kalimantan, I think it seemed unreal to me because what happened is I actually established codes of communication with wild adult male orangutans. Now, wild females, it wasn't so necessary because they stayed up in the trees. They weren't coming into your space and you weren't going into their space. But when a wild adult male, please remember 300-400 pounds, came down to the ground, you and he had to talk about it because they don't talk, but they communicate. And so what we did is with each different male, I worked out a different kind of communication, like what he would accept and what I would accept. And we actually kind of learned to talk to each other so that we could both be in the same place. I came to those kinds of agreements with a number of wild adult males, what they would accept and what I would accept, but mainly what they would accept.
This is almost a huge metaphor for life. What you just described is, I think, what you call diplomacy.
Yes, well, I'll tell you, I mean, I have my opinions of what we do with hostages. And what you do with hostages is you treat them as well as you can, fatten them up, show how good you are to them, get them to love you, and when they leave, just like those bank tellers in Stockholm, Sweden say, don't hurt my kidnappers. You know, I mean, you know, the things that people can do. And sometimes I don't understand why people don't do things.
Thank you so much for sitting down with me. I know it's late there. You're in Jakarta. I'm in Connecticut. We're worlds apart. But, you know, just really not only thank you for the interview, but for what you've done. I mean, you know, there's so few people who can walk through their life and feel like they've made a difference. And you certainly have. And for that, I'm appreciative. I hope you enjoyed our podcast. Now we have a little favor to ask. We'd really appreciate your support. So make sure to leave us a 5-star review and hit that subscribe button so you'll never miss another episode. See you out on the trail.